Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Thank you for turning out in such great numbers on this very hot, very sultry evening. Before we kick off, do keep yourselves hydrated, particularly those of you who are standing. That water is drinkable, so please don't hesitate to come and fill up your cups when during the event, because really we don't want any of you passing out on our hands. To lavish praise on a book that has already won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, the National Book Award for Fiction, and the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence, that is on the current shortlist of the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and that has picked up recommendations from both Oprah Winfrey and President Obama, may feel like overkill. And yet, The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead is that rare kind of book that not only has an immediate and profound impact on the reader, but that stays with you in the weeks and months after you've put it down. The novel tells the story of Cora, who escapes from the bonds of slavery on a cotton plantation in Georgia with the help of the Underground Railroad, a network which, in Colson Whitehead's reimagining, has assumed a physical form, complete with buried stations, steam-powered locomotives, and guards. As Cora advances from state to state, however, the dream of true freedom seems increasingly elusive. Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad is not just a book about historical slavery, but confronts the terrors and threats faced by black people in America from the pre-Civil War era right up to the present day. Bending literary genres almost to breaking point, it is a virtuoso, powerful, and fiercely moral work by a writer at the height of his powers. In addition to The Underground Railroad, Colson Whitehead is the best-selling author of the novels The Noble Hustle, of Zone 1, Sag Harbor, The Institutionist, John Henry's Days, and Apex Hyde the Hertz, and the non-fiction The Colossus of New York and The Noble Hustle. Please welcome him to Shakespeare and Company.
Howdy, thanks for coming in this heat. I'm very honored to be here. And I guess I first had the idea for the book 17 years ago. I was sitting on the couch and came across a reference to the Underground Railroad, and remembered how when I was in fourth grade and my teacher was telling me about it, I envisioned a literal subway beneath the earth, which is very impractical. And then she explained how it actually worked. But I thought that day, wouldn't it be a weird idea for a book if I made the metaphorical railroad into something real? And that is more of a premise than an idea, than a story. So I quickly added the element that each state that our protagonist goes through is a different state of American possibility, like Gullivers Travels. And it seemed like a really good idea. I knew if I did it back then, I would have fucked it up. And so I decided to wait. I figured that if I wrote more books, I might become a better writer, and I could pull off the idea in the way it needed to be pulled off. If I was more mature, at the time I was a sort of 30-year-old douchebag in New York, and I figured that if I was older, had adventures, rode on a tramp steamer and stabbed a hobo with a penknife or something, I might take these worldly adventures and bring them to the book. And so each time I finished a novel, I would think, oh, am I ready? And each time the answer was no. And that went on until about 14 years ago when I'd sold a book to my editor. But I was feeling some doubts about it. And so I decided to tell my wife about the Underground Railroad book. As some of you know, in a marriage, sometimes you have to make conversation to kill the silences. And so I told her about it. And she said, honey, I don't want to say the book you're working on now about a Brooklyn writer going through a midlife crisis is dumb per se, but the Underground Railroad book sounds really good. So I was like, huh. And Tuesday, I decided to talk to my agent and tell her about the idea. And she's, worked with her for many years. She's very supportive. And she said both ideas sound good, which is not very helpful. But then she did something she never does, which is email me on a Sunday. And she said, I can't stop thinking about that Underground Railroad idea. So I was like, huh. Wednesday was shrink day, so I told my shrink. And my shrink was like, what are you, crazy? I mean, we both know you're crazy, but with your issues, this book is totally up your alley. So that only left my editor, who had already sold this other book to. And he just said, giddy up, motherfucker, which is old school publishing talk for that's a very compelling idea and we should pursue it. And so I did, and this is what happened. So the book opens in Georgia on the plantation owned by Terrence and James Randall, two brothers. And Our protagonist is Cora, who's 16 or 17 years old. It's unclear. Slave masters didn't necessarily keep track of how old their property was, and slaves were property. So in the same way you might have a vacuum cleaner but not know exactly the day you bought it, she's not sure what her birthday is and how old she is. Her mother's left years before, run away, and so she's been raising herself. There's a reference to Caesar, who's a new addition to the plantation. He was raised and enslaved on a plantation in Virginia, and was told his whole life that when his owner died, he'd be set free. And of course, that didn't happen. And he was sold down south with his parents, whom he never saw again. And he's come to Randall, which is a very different kind of enslavement. The further south you go, the worse the plantation system gets. So now he's on with the Randalls and Cora. It's old jockey's birthday. He's the oldest slave in the plantation, and whenever he feels a need for a release, he declares, "It's my birthday," and they have music and dancing, and it's a brief release from the plantation hell. And then finally, there's a reference to Chester, who is a 10-year-old boy, an orphan, whom Cora has taken under her wing. The music stopped, the circle broke. Sometimes a slave will be lost in a brief eddy of liberation, in the sway of a sudden reverie among the furrows, or while untangling the mysteries of an early morning dream, in the middle of a song on a warm Sunday night. Then it comes always, the overseer's cry, the call to work, the shadow of the master, the reminder that she is only a human being for a tiny moment across the eternity of her servitude. The Randall Brothers had emerged from the house and were among them. The slaves stepped aside, making calculations of what distance represented the right proportion of fear and respect. Godfrey, James's houseboy, held up a lantern. According to old jockey, James favored the mother, stout as a barrel and just as firm in countenance, and Terence took after the father, tall and owl-faced, perpetually on the verge of swooping down on prey. In addition to the land, they inherited their father's tailor, who arrived once a month in his rickety carriage with his samples of linen and cotton. The brothers dressed alike when they were children and continued to do so into manhood. Their white trousers and shirts were as clean as the laundry girl's hands could make them, and the orange glow of the lantern made the men look like ghosts emerging from the dark. "Master James," jockey said. His good hand gripped his arm of his chair as if to rise. "Master Terence." Terence said, "Don't let us disturb you. My brother and I were discussing business and heard the music. I told him, 'Now that is the most god-awful racket I've ever heard.'" The Randalls were drinking wine out of goblets of cut glass and looked as if they drained a few bottles. Cora searched for Caesar's face in the crowd. She didn't find him. He hadn't been present the last time the brothers appeared together on the northern half of the plantation. You did well to remember the different lessons of those occasions. Something always happened when the Randalls ventured into the quarter, sooner or later. A new thing coming that you couldn't predict until it was upon you. James left the daily operations to his man Connolly and rarely visited. He might grant a tour to a visitor, a distinguished neighbor or a curious planter from another neck of the woods, but it was rare. James rarely addressed his niggers, who'd been taught by the lash to keep working and ignore his presence. When Terence appeared in his brother's half of the plantation, he usually appraised each slave and made a note of which men were the most able and which women the most appealing. Content to leer at his brother's women, he grazed heartily upon those of his own half. "I like to taste my plums," Terence said, prowling the rows of cabins to see what struck his fancy. He violated the bonds of affection, sometimes visiting slaves on their wedding night to show the husband the proper way to discharge his marital duty. He tasted his plums and broke the skin and left his mark. It was accepted that James was of a different orientation. To hear his valet Prideful tell it, James confined his erotic energies to specialized rooms in a New Orleans establishment. The madam was broad-minded and modern, adept in the trajectories of human desire. Prideful's stories were hard to believe, despite assurances that he received his reports from the staff of the place, with whom he'd grown close over the years. After all, what kind of white man would willingly submit to the whip? Terence scratched his cane in the dirt. It had been his father's cane, topped with a silver wolf's head. Many remembered its bite on their flesh. Terence said, "Then I recollected James tell me about a nigger he had down here, could recite the Declaration of Independence. I can't bring myself to believe him. I thought perhaps tonight he can show me, since everyone is out and about from the sound of it." James said, "We'll settle it. Where is that boy, Michael?" No one said anything. Godfrey waved the lantern around pathetically. Moses was the boss unfortunate enough to stand closest to the Randall brothers. He cleared his throat. "Michael dead, Master James." Michael, the slave in question, had indeed possessed the ability to recite long passages. According to Connolly, who heard the story from the nigger trader, Michael's former master was fascinated by the abilities of South American parrots and reasoned that if a bird could be taught limericks, a slave might be taught to remember as well. Merely glancing at the size of their skulls told you that a nigger possessed a bigger sized brain than a bird. Michael had been the son of his master's coachman, had a brand of animal cleverness, the kind you see in pigs sometimes. The master and his unlikely pupil starred with simple rhymes and short passages from popular British versifiers. They went slow over the words the nigger didn't understand, and if truth be told, the master only half understood. But they made miracles, the tobacco farmer and the coachman's son. The Declaration of Independence was their masterpiece. Michael's ability never amounted to more than a parlor trick, delighting visitors before the discussion turned, as it always did, to the diminished faculties of niggers. His owner grew bored and sold the boy south. By the time Michael got to Randall, some torture or punishment had addled his senses. He was a mediocre worker. He complained of noises and black spells that blotted his memory. In exasperation, Connolly beat out what little brains he had left. It was a scourging that Michael was not intended to survive, and it achieved its purpose. "I should have been told," James said, his displeasure plain. Michael's recitation had been a novel diversion the 2 times he trotted the nigger out for guests. Terence liked to tease his brother. "James," he said, "you need to keep better account of your property. Don't meddle." Terence continued, "I knew you let your slaves have revels, but I had no idea they were so extravagant. Are you trying to make me look bad?" "Don't pretend you care what a nigger thinks about you," James said. His glass was empty. He turned to go. "Oh, one more song, James. These sounds have grown on me." George and Wesley, the musicians, were forlorn. Noble and his tambourine were nowhere to be seen. James pressed his lips into a slit. He gestured, and the men started playing. Terence tapped his cane. His face sank as he took in the crowd. "You're not going to dance? I have to insist. You and you and you." They didn't wait for their master's signal. The slaves of the northern half converged on the alley, haltingly, trying to insinuate themselves into their previous rhythm and put on a show. Putting on a show for master was a familiar skill, the small angles and advantages of the mask, and they shook off their fear as they settled into their performance. Oh, how they capered and hollered, shouted and hopped. Certainly this was the most lively song they'd ever heard, the musicians the most accomplished players the colored race had to offer. Cora dragged herself into the circle, checking the Randall brothers' reactions on every turn like everyone else. Jockey tumbled his hands in his lap to keep time. Cora found Caesar's face. He stood in the shadow of the kitchen, his expression flat. Then he withdrew. "You!" It was Terence. He held his hand before him as if it were covered in some eternal stain that only he could see. Then Cora caught sight of it, the single drop of red wine staining the cuff of his lovely white shirt. Chester, the boy, had bumped him. Chester simpered and bowed before the white man. Sorry, master, sorry, master." The cane crashed across his shoulder and head again and again. The boy screamed and shrank to the dirt as the blows continued. Terence's arm rose and fell. James looked tired. One drop. A feeling settled over Cora. She'd not been under its spell in years, since she brought the hatchet down on Blake's doghouse and sent the splinters into the air. She'd seen men hung from trees and left for buzzards and crows, women carved open to the bones with a cat o' nine tails, feet cut off to prevent escape and hands cut off to stop theft. She'd seen boys and girls younger than this beaten and had done nothing. This night the feeling settled on her heart again. It grabbed hold of her, and before the slave part of her caught up with the human part of her, she was bent over the boy's body as a shield. She held the cane in her hand like a swamp man handling a snake, and saw the ornament at its tip. The silver wolf bared its silver teeth. Then the cane was out of her hand. It came down on her head. It crashed down again, and this time the silver teeth ripped across her eyes, and her blood splattered the dirt.
Thanks so much. Let's begin with Cora. When you conceived the book, when you had the idea 17 years ago, and then when you started writing it a few years back, was it always obvious to you that the principal protagonist should be a woman? And if so, why?
I mean, over the years when I had it in the back of my head, I think, it's a man running away. It's a man looking for a wife who'd been sold off. A parent looking for a child, and finally I settled on Cora, someone looking for an absent mother. And there are a few reasons. There's a famous slave narrative written by Harriet Jacobs, who ran away and spent 7 years in an attic before she got passage out of North Carolina. And she writes in the early part of her memoir about how when a slave girl becomes a slave woman, she enters into a new hellish phase of slavery, because when you're a woman, you're supposed to have babies. More babies means more hands to pick more cotton, means more money for the master. And it's just a different dimension of slavery than what happened to men. And that seemed worth exploring. Mm-hmm. I hadn't done a mother-daughter relationship before, and that seemed worthy of doing. And then I had a string of very meditative male narrators, and so the voice in the back of my head said, mix it up, don't do the same crap over and over. Mm-hmm. So that's Cora.
And my impression was, as soon as we meet Cora, I mean, she comes to us a fully rounded character. She seems, despite being so young, there seems to be a real sense of quiet determination to her, even though it's not immediately clear that she is going to make the break from the plantation, that she's going to escape. And I was just wondering, was that how she came to you once you had the idea? Did the character come more or less fully formed?
Well, I mean, I started with the idea of making the Underground Railroad real, and there's no characters or locale, and so I come up with the story and the characters. And so writing in 2015 in my comfortable apartment, it's hard to project myself into the mind of a slave who could have the fortitude and imagination and faith to run away. And so trying to figure out a character who can embody all those attributes, I came up with Cora. And the two moments that were key for conceiving her in my mind are the scene I just read where she protects Chester. Why do you stand up that one time after seeing the same scene, someone being beaten in front of you? What makes a person do that? And then earlier she stands up to a bully who wants to steal her small garden that she's inherited from her parents, grandmother and mother. Resources are very scarce. You don't really have any property, and so the garden is very important to her, and an older slave tries to take it from her, and she stands up to him. And so those two moments of determination and badassery, for me, define who she is and helped determine all her other reactions in the book.
Mm-hmm. And so we talked about how the Underground Railroad, how you've essentially given it physical form. Now, I know the French semiotician Roland Barthes talks about reality effects in fiction, the sort of the devices that writers use to make the reader think what they're reading is real or could be real. And it strikes me that this is almost the reverse of that. This is kind of an unreality effect, because we all, or a lot of, we know roughly the idea of the Underground Railroad, but we know that it didn't exist as a sort of an actual railroad network. So it makes me wonder, you're clearly giving a sign to the reader that what you're doing is not straightforward historical fiction. Was it, once you'd had this idea, was it always the case that you were going to have it as a physical railroad? Did you ever consider just writing let's say, a more straightforward historical novel, which was kind of closer to the facts?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the original idea is making it real and having these alternative states. So immediately, from its very conception, there's going to be a fantastic element. And it's not a straightforward historical novel. I'm not like in some historical novelist union I'll get kicked out of. Like at the next meeting, Hilary Mantel is going to be like, do I gotta choke a motherfucker for fucking, you know? And so all the stuff I do in the book I couldn't have done if it was a straightforward story of a slave running north. Once she gets on the railroad, we're in the fantastic element, and I can move historical episodes around to create friction and make a new reckoning with what they mean. And but before she does get to the railroad, I did want to have Georgia be as realistic as possible. And that means it's brutal and a lot of terrible things happen. But before I started deforming reality, I wanted to sort of get it straight to testify for my family members who went through it 100 years ago, for other slaves, just to speak for them as much as I, you know, not to be corny or pretentious, as much as I can testify for their experience as I could. I wanted to get it straight before I change things around.
And one of the elements in the book which essentially testifies to the real history are the a lot of the chapters begin with adverts, or which I guess were put in publications or in posters to for people looking for escaped slaves. Now I believe all of these are real.
Yeah, they're all real except for the last one, which is addressed with Cora's, and that's me sort of, after I put her through a lot of stuff, me trying to talk to her as a person, one-to-one, if that makes sense. It doesn't make sense in the story because it's me talking to her, but the ones earlier are from the University of North Carolina. They digitized all the runaway slave ads, and it's a digital database, which is good because I don't want to leave the house, so I can just go and download it, and copyright laws being what they are, I can just put them in there without getting sued. And as a fiction writer, I like doing voices and imitating different kinds of speech, but I couldn't compete with the really compressed histories of those slave ads. You know, it'll say $30 reward for my slave Bessie who ran away for no reason. Of course, we know why she ran away. She has a burn on her arm, and we think, how'd she get that burn? And also, there's a guy at the newspaper whose job is to write these things, and the enterprise of slavery was so vast that, it captured everyone, not just the enslaved and the enslavers, but a guy at a newspaper who I assume is trying to move ahead and write articles, who has to coach slave masters on the language for a very terse and efficient runaway slave ad.
And I think that was, for me, one of the most unsettling things about reading the book, actually, was, I mean, earlier you mentioned Gulliver's Travels, and in fact there's a moment where you refer to it in the book. I think Caesar is maybe reading Gulliver's Travels, and there's certainly, I could certainly see the comparison, but one of the things, I guess, with Gulliver's Travels is that it's such pure fantasy and pure fiction that the reader never doubts that any of it actually happened. One of the unsettling things I think about this book is this blend of real elements and fantastical elements, which I think in a way for the reader leads to, or at least for me, led to more questions than answers about sort of some of the things that could have happened. So I think particularly in the first stop in South Carolina, there were a lot of things when I actually then had to go and look up to see, did that actually happen? Yeah. And was it your intention to intentionally unsettle the reader in that way?
Well yeah, I made a choice to have each state be different, and then so I had to come up with a culture of each one, and was it saying about America or freedom? And so I think in terms of how I deal with reality and fantasy in the book, for many years, I'm also not a big Gullivers Travels fan, but when I talked about the book for many years, I'd say different states of America, and people were like, oh, that sounds stupid. And then when I said Gullivers Travels, they're like, oh, I understand. So, but for many years, the different states were much more fantastic. So South Carolina, where there are various genetic experiments, took place in a fantastic future with very hyper-futuristic DNA experiments. And then a few months before I started working on the book, I reread 100 Years of Solitude, and it seemed Gabriel Garcia Marquez's brand of magic realism might be a useful tool. In the book, they had an interview in the back, and it talks about how when he was a kid, he would listen to his grandmother's stories, and she would mix in mundane facts with fantastic facts with what he called a brick face. Mm-hmm. And he never knew what was real and what was fake. And it seemed so many fantastic things happen in the book, but if I did them with that brick face and mixed the very mundane reality of slavery and mixed in the fantastic, absurd moments and did them and the narrator had a brick face, it might more efficiently work for the book.
And it interested me, the effect it had on me as well when I was reading it, because what I was kind of comparing it to as I read was sort of the way that, let's say, certain narrative songs work. So whether it might be something like The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll by Bob Dylan, or Strange Fruit, or something like that, or even then I saw at the end that you referenced David Bowie as somebody who you listened to a lot of his music, and of course Bowie was somebody who told stories very effectively through his songs. So I was just wondering, is that sort of method of storytelling, perhaps that's sort of giving the way songs give that kind of slightly mythological or slightly sort of archetypal edge to a story, is that something that might have inspired you?
Well, for me, I mean, I take my influences for everywhere. I think when Cora steps into the Underground Railroad, that's like a Twilight Zone moment. And so all the books I love and the TV shows and movies and music I love, they all sort of go in different ways. Mm-hmm. And in the back of the book, I talk about some of the songs I was listening to a lot. The Misfits, I had a late in life Misfits Reckoning. I was very glad. And I guess when I work, I grew up in New York City, and there's always a lot of noise. There's always like car honking or a car alarm going off, someone being choked to death upstairs. So there's always like noise when I'm working. And so I've always played music when I work, and I have like a 3,000 song playlist, and it goes from hip hop to jazz to The Clash to the Misfits. And so all the songs I like keep me company, and I can sing along or have a dance party in the middle if I need a break.
Now, one of the most terrifying elements of the book, and I think also one of the most kind of fascinating and compelling characters, is Ridgway, the slave hunter. So, first of all, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about where the inspiration for this character came from.
Sure. Well, I find Cora to be a formidable character, so I wanted a formidable protagonist, and it took me a while to figure out what he sounded like. And so for 6 months in my manuscript, I just had intro Ridgway TK, because I know what he walked and talked like. And then I'm from New York, and I write a lot about New York, and I was sort of sad I was writing a book in the South because I couldn't put New York in there. And then I read Eric Foner's Gateway to Freedom, A History of the Underground Railroad, which deals with the sort of spy versus spy war between abolitionists and slave catchers in New York. Police might arrest a runaway slave, and then abolitionist lawyers free them before the slave catcher could get there, and all these various legal stratagems going back and forth. And then it seemed to me, I can make Ridgway a New Yorker for 2 pages, and that would be a way in. So he is for me, he's the sort of brutish warrior philosopher with various ideas about white supremacy and manifest destiny and imperial powers, and the Tennessee chapter, which in the book has been ravaged by the Yellow Plague and forest fires, is for me a blasted landscape for Ridgway and Cora, a blank stage for them to interact and have this sort of combat over their different world views. And then he has a little assistant named Homer people ask about. He's a black boy of 10 years who's a freed slave, but still hangs out with Ridgway and shackles himself to his carriage every night, their wagon. And for me, with that relationship, I was just trying to illuminate one of the weird corners of the master-slave dynamic. There were slaves who were freed at the end of the Civil War who stayed with their masters because they knew nothing else. They couldn't conceive of anything outside the acreage that they'd known their whole lives. And that's odd to us, obviously. And then there were slave masters who were raised by an older female slave named Bessie, and they might say, I love Bessie. Bessie raised me. She's a part of the family. And of course, they would beat Bessie and abuse Bessie's children, yet still believing that they were Bessie was a part of the family. So Ridgway becomes a way with Homer to discuss or illuminate a different corner of the master-slave relationship.
And I find it interesting that term you used, the kind of warrior philosopher, because that's I think one of the things that is most fascinating about Ridgway is that he seems to embody a certain conception of. I mean, he never quite uses. He never uses the term the American dream, but at the moment he talks about the American spirit and the American imperative. Which, I mean, I quoted a bit here. He said, "I prefer the American spirit, the one that called us from the old world to the new, to conquer and build and civilize, and destroy what needs to be destroyed, to lift up lesser races, if not lift up, subjugate, and if not subjugate, exterminate. Our destiny by divine prescription, the American imperative." And it strikes me that he kind of embodies a lot of the kind of the dark side of what, we might think of as the American dream.
Certainly, I mean, that's the... That's what makes America great, is the ability to destroy and steal and ravage the landscape in the pursuit of liberty and happiness. And so, so that's Ridgway.
And it's a lot of ideas which still resonate today. I mean, this is one of the things. Like I said in the introduction that there were a lot of contemporary resonances to the novel. It's become almost a cliche to say that sort of dystopias say more about our current society than they do about any future society. And do you think so-called historical novels, and in this case I'll put it in very heavy scare quotes, but do you think they could also be said to say more about today than they do about the past?
Well, I think I'm writing now, and I can't escape that. I gave a talk last week, and someone said, "This is a historical novel, but there's a lesbian and there's a hint of S&M, in that section I read." And I was like, well, maybe they didn't talk about it 150 years ago, but lesbians did exist 150 years ago. So just because you're writing a period piece doesn't mean that you leave out things that weren't part of the conversation. So I think different storytelling modes, whether horror, realism, allegory, or historical novel, or just different ways of getting at the world. There are different tools that we use as writers to attack the world in different ways. And so I switch genres a lot, and they have their strengths and their weaknesses in terms of talking about the world. And I try to find how this genre or that genre can provide a different register to address things.
Because I wonder, because you said sort of you had the idea 17 years ago, and you gave us the reasons in your introduction about why you didn't and why you couldn't have written it 17 years ago, and they were all very personal. They were all about your experience and your state as a writer. But it struck me as fitting so well into sort of the contemporary dialogue. Whether you started writing towards sort of in the final few years of the Obama administration, when the Black Lives Matter movement was really sort of getting sort of public acknowledgement, and I think of other writers that came to mind while reading the book. I think specifically, for example, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I was just wondering, could you have written the book 17 years ago from a sort of a societal perspective, or is the dialogue more open now to discussing the kind of issues that the book discusses?
I don't think we're really open now to discussing the issues in the book. I don't think anything's happened in the last 17 years that has, in terms of cultural events that informed the book. I was asked a lot about Black Lives Matter when the book came out. But for me, being a black man in America, we have these periodic discussions about police brutality when there's a particularly atrocious example of it. And we talk about it for a year, and then we stop talking about it. And then 3 years later, there's another atrocious example, and we talk about it, and then we stop talking about it. So for me, the fact that we have an incredible police brutality problem in America is not news. It's a feature of my reality. So when Ferguson happened, it was the 100th of a series of those kind of occasions. In terms of me being able to write it, 5 or 10 years ago, probably would have been much longer. I think when I got to the part with the Living Museum, and it came out, and it was only 2 pages, and I was like, I'm done. And I think 10 years ago or 5 years ago, I would have had a chapter on the curator and his curating philosophy. I would have described the building of the railroad and the right-of-way and how they actually pulled off this engineering model. And for me, the railroad is not what the book is about. It's about Cora, getting Cora to these different arenas where she can be tested and grow as a person and develop her ideas of self and freedom. So it's merely, so I think I've written a few books and gotten better at doing different things and lost interest in other aspects of storytelling.
And one of the most striking things, and this came across in the extract that you read, is first of all the level of violence that afflicted upon the characters. And again, actually, it made me think of a line from I think from Between the World and Me, in which Coates says, "In America, it's traditional to destroy the black body." And it seemed this sort of constant sort of succession of violence inflicted upon Cora and the other slaves or escaped slaves. But also the way you express it is in a very sober, very matter-of-fact way. And for me, that in a way increased the impact than if you had gone into sort of very elaborate or very brutal or bloody descriptions of the violence. Was that a sort of a very conscious stylistic decision of yours to just state the facts very clearly rather than to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about the brick face with the realistic and the fantastic. And then in reading slave narratives, they would describe the most atrocious events in their life with a straight face, unadorned. Because if it's your everyday existence, you don't dramatize it. If you've been beaten 20 times, how can you make the 20th beating more dramatic? And so there's the brick face in terms of reality and fantasy, and also the brick face in the matter-of-factness of the violence. And so I borrowed that from slave narratives. It didn't need to be adorned because I think it speaks for itself.
And just finally from me, before I open up to questions from the audience, because I suspect there will probably be quite a few. It was announced a few months ago that the book is going to be adapted, and it's going to be done so by Barry Jenkins, who the writer and director of Moonlight, which, I mean, it strikes me as one of the, I can't think of a more appropriate combination of filmmaker and story. Was that something that you were involved in the process, and how do you feel about the
I'm excited. You know, I saw his movie in August before anything happened with it. On like a tiny box on my TV screen because it was on my computer screen because it was like a expiring link, so it could be pirated. And I talked to him, and he was really smart. And usually, you know, my books have too many black people in them to be made into movies, and so I was excited someone was interested, and he had really great ideas. So I think winning the Oscar for Best Picture helped with the contracts coming through. And so I'm excited to see what will happen with it. I'm not involved in it. I mean, I've had a few conversations where he's asked me, you know, who is Cora, why Mabel, this, and stuff like that. And I'm happy to answer that. But, I feel pretty separate, and I'm happy to be a spectator.
Thank you. Okay, if you have a question for Colson, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear you. Where's the microphone is there? Okay, let us begin. Okay, with that lady just over there. Yeah, you.
Hello. So I think writing is an extreme act of courage, but I'm just wondering, in the writing of the book, writing about Cora or other characters, or in your research, you know, you never know how you would act in those circumstances. As you talk about being tested, are there some things that you think you couldn't have done, and how did you approach that? You know, wow, I couldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, slaves rebelled in different ways. If you have a child on the plantation, can you run away? So there are smaller acts of rebellion, and then the bigger ones of escaping. I have no idea what I would do. I mean, I think the hardest part, people say, oh, you know, was it hard to write the book and put the violence in there? Once I started, I would write and then knock off at the end of the day and not think about it. But doing the research and contemplating that, you know, I really shouldn't be here. You know, it's a miracle that any black people survived this system. And I'm descended from people who somehow survived. They passed on their DNA, and I can't imagine what they went through. And I can't imagine how I would have coped, how I would have rebelled if I would not, you know, if I would have or wouldn't. it's an impossible situation. I can't even conceive of the experience. I mean, this book is my attempt to capture from a 2015 point of view, but I really can't understand what it was like.
Hi. First of all, thank you. It's an amazing book. I was a little curious about how it got built as I read it, so maybe if you ever get in the mind of writing a short piece on that. I can't imagine. I can't imagine the pain. I mean, I can. I read it, but I can't imagine the pain behind it. I'm super curious as I watched you read it. What's the experience of sitting here reading something, and you read it, you know, somewhat matter of factly? What's the experience of being in your skin, reading it to this audience? Certainly here in Paris, and maybe even more so in the U.S., and maybe in parts of the U.S. where the complicity was greater or more direct. And I'm just wondering if you're willing to talk about that, because that really strikes me as an amazing thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of my books have humor in them, not this book. And I'm used to talking about my books in a very casual way and making jokes. And so I joke, I speak in a very lighthearted way about how I decided to write the book. And then I go into this very brutal passage. And I think some people experience different emotions with it. Before the book came out, people asked, is it going to be weird reading it in the South? Because like slavery was in the South, but there's actually slaves in New York as well. And I can walk, 2 blocks from my house to where there's a plaque about, some sort of historical marker about slavery. So I found, in terms of audiences' reactions, I found the oddest questions come from states or cities where there are very few black people. So Tucson and then Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Instead of asking about the book, they sort of take the opportunity to ask a black guy a question, So I worked in New York 20 years ago, and I said black, and my African-American friend scolded me because she might be called African-American. What do you think? I'm like, I'm not Emily Post of, how to talk to black people. So it made me realize that actually a lot of white people have no black have no black people in their lives, and no opportunities for any kind of reaction, any kind of relationship or interaction, even a mundane thing about what do we call you? so.
This is the best book that I've read since Beloved. I really have to thank you for that. It's just been really moving.
Thanks for reading.
The question I have is maybe a little bit bizarre, but of all the people that you thank Stephen Jay Gould, and he's a scientist, and the question of understanding reality and how do we go forward with what kind of society we're living in today is real deep. So I was wondering what kind of influence he had. I understand Eric Foner and some of the other people, Baptiste and...
Sure, well, I guess I researched and wrote the book like in a year, but I was drawing upon stuff I read decades ago. And so in college, I took a class with him, and he talked about, and we studied his book, The Mismeasure of Man, which is about scientific racism in the 19th century, measuring the skull sizes of Mongoloids, Negroids, and Caucasians to see how big their brains were in order to justify lawful acts of racism. And so that comes into play in the South Carolina section, where I bring in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and forced sterilizations, talking about the attitude towards the black body. There's an attitude embodied by slavery and its punishments. And then there's an attitude embodied by the forced sterilizations of immigrants, the feeble-minded, and people of color in the 19th century, embodied by ideas of eugenics, which also come to play in the book, in South Carolina and in North Carolina when I talk about the final solution of black people. Nazis in Germany in the 1930s barred all their a lot of their eugenics theories from American scientists. And so I drew upon slave narratives and then also books of popular science like Stephen Jay Gould's, and it stayed with me and informed the book.
Okay, there's a gentleman right at the back there.
Hi. I love the book, and I love the ending. I found that it really deepened the mystery and kind of internalized the metaphor, and I was just curious if you could speak to whether that ending came to you in a vision or you discovered it in the process, or...
Well, I mean, for the last couple of books, I've had the last image or sometimes even the last line on the first day I've thought of them. And so I knew where Cora was going to end up, and in that place. I didn't know if it was going to be New York or Massachusetts or Canada or the place he does end up. But for me, that's it made sense to end there. And I think so many things happen in that final section. There's Valentine Farm, various things relating to her relatives, and I talked about the Underground Railroad as a portal, as not being interested in hanging out in the underground. It's really a portal to get her from place to place. And the final journey is the one where we spend the most time with her. And I guess that tunnel for me is a brief interlude where we're in this, a place of metaphor more than in other sections of the book before she gets out of the tunnel and is in this other place. And I think that, looking back, I think those are the best 30 pages I've written. That final ending, and I felt really good writing them. And still, when I think back upon them, I feel like an immense sense of pride, and I'm sort of moved by my own journey through the mountain. So.
So Cora never had a romantic relationship that also wasn't a source of terror or hurt for her, and she never had a sexual relationship that wasn't forced on her either. I'm just wondering if you were ever tempted to give that more of kind of a more fleshed out story, or like why you decided to also make this such a source of pain for her as well.
Sure. I mean, there's a big body count in the book, and that was a reality of people escaping. If you were captured in Georgia and Florida during the height of the slave plantation system, you could be put to death. And so a lot of terrible things happened to Cora and other people. And it seemed, as she grows into her sense of personhood, the assault that happens to her early in the book informs who she is and her romantic notions and sexual notions of herself. And that's part of her journey as she goes to these different states or arenas, as I call them, and her notion of freedom expands and changes, her notion of self expands and changes. So do her ideas of romantic possibility, whether it's with Caesar or Royal. And so her ideas of what she can have and what she wants to be and who she wants to be with change during the course of the book, and that's also part of the story I was trying to tell.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. I'm an English teacher, and I always talk about the influence of other authors on authors. I'm just curious about whether you had other writers that inspired you along with stylistically or thematically, or that you just really revered. Yeah,
I mean, and there are plenty, and as I said before, it's Twilight Zone and also David Bowie. They're in there somewhere. In terms of books, I'm always just trying to figure out what I can get from different writers. And I get one thing from Raymond Carver, and something else from Thomas Pynchon, and something else from Toni Morrison. And they're in all the books in different ways. Sometimes I'm thinking of them more explicitly. Sometimes when I'm working on something, I want to read what other people have done, and sometimes I don't. I don't want to get infected. With this book, I was like, I'll reread Beloved and The Known World and Middle Passage by Charles Johnson, books I read decades ago, and see how they dealt with slavery. And I got 30 pages into Beloved, and I was like, fuck, I'm totally screwed. It's Toni fucking Morrison. So, but, no matter what you're writing about, whether it's slavery or war or relationships, my theory is that someone smarter and more talented has done it before you. So all you can hope is that you have something individual to contribute to whatever genre or kind of story you're telling. So Garcia Marquez in this book. And then, I think in a book like John Henry Days of Sag Harbor, 2 earlier books of mine, there's an encyclopedic impulse, which I recognize in Moby Dick and, say, Thomas Pynchon, which I didn't think worked in this book, which is why the Museum of Living History is only 2 pages and not 10 pages. I think these different storytelling modes have different strengths and weaknesses, and hopefully you're making the right choice about what kind of narrator and sentences to use.
Hi. I was just wondering if you purposely made Cora likable, and if so, how did you make her complex and burdened at the same time?
Sure. I mean, if you can hear, did I purposely make Cora likable? Some people say she's not likable, so it depends on your mileage will vary. But in terms of making her complex, that's my job. Hopefully, I pull it off. I think when I think about my career, my first couple of books I started with intellectual premise. I was trying to explore how do we update this industrial age character of John Henry for the information age? And then with Sag Harbor On, I think I've started with people and situations, and I think the character work I've done in the last couple of books, I think, paid off in Cora, and I'm glad you find her likable. I find, she makes me crack up, but again, your mileage may vary.
Okay.
I'm also an English teacher from Texas, and I just happened to sit next to a history teacher from California before this started, and we were talking about the possibility of using your book with students. So I was just wondering, do you imagine high school students using this? And if so, how would you want it to be taught? What would your advice to teachers be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think about my books in that way, but it's being taught in high school and colleges already. I think because it does hop around and touch on so many different parts of American history and European history, you can bring in the Holocaust. You can bring in scientific racism. You can bring in a lot of different things in the book. You can bring a lot of different things. And so I think in terms, probably high school students will probably have more anxiety about, is this true or not true? But then you can teach them about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and put that in context in history and also in the book. And so I haven't talked to a lot of teachers who've taught it, but there's some historical context you can give them to enrich it, I guess, or explain some of their concerns, I guess.
As you can hear, Notre Dame is just ringing us out, so we're almost going to have to knock it on the head there. But I'd just like to finish by building on what this lady asked you. And I just after you write a book like this, a book which has such an impact, not just from the question of sort of prizes and plaudits and great reviews, but also, as you can see from readers here tonight who've read it and they're considering teaching it in school, that it's had this kind of sort of enormous impact on people's lives and on the culture. How does that affect you as a writer? Are you able to sort of protect your writing instinct, your writing urge from these kind of influences and this sort of sense of responsibility that writing a book that has such a big impact makes? Well,
there's 2 things there. This book was hard to write, and my first book was hard to write, and they're all hard to write. And so that's not going to go away. I was pretty happy in April. I heard about the Pulitzer. I was like, I'm going to get a mood for a change. And then next day I tried to write a page, and I was like, this sucks. Why do I do this? So I try to do the best job I can each time, and like The Intuitionist was the best book I could write when I was 28, and this is the best book I could write when I was 45. And then sometimes people come along for the ride and get it, and then sometimes they don't. This is my 8th book, and definitely some books have left people scratching their heads. And then sometimes with this book, sometimes people come along for the ride, and it's very lovely.
Great. Now, we do have stacks and stacks of the Underground Railroad. We also have all of Colson's backlist, some of the books that left people scratching their heads. So please do pass into the shop, and I'm sure Colson would be delighted to sign the books that you buy. Also, do stick around. As always, we're going to serve a little bit of wine. The evening is not finished yet, so do hang out with us. Until then, though, and I mean, I would just say one more time, such a wonderful book. I really can't recommend it highly enough. I'm pretty sure that came across, but in case it didn't, really buy this book. It's extraordinary. And luckily we have copies, I think, probably for pretty much everyone here. So,
and thank you guys so much.
Please give it up to Colson Whitehead.